Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today's case is about a situation that first appeared straightforward but soon raised serious questions. As investigators looked closer, the timeline didn't fully add up, and key details began to stand out. This case would later rely heavily on evidence, witness statements, and courtroom testimony to uncover what really happened.
Good morning. It's been a long couple of weeks, hasn't it? And I've been wanting to talk to you for the entire time, the entire trial really, but especially since the state rested. I have never been a part of a murder case where the state was so unsure of their evidence that they rested their case and got through the first half of their closing argument without ever telling the jury the facts of how the murder is supposed to be committed. I want you to take a moment and think of any question you have about how this murder was allegedly committed. Any question at all, just hold it in your mind. You might be wondering what the state's theory of how this murder was committed actually is. That's a good one, because they haven't given us any specifics. They haven't put up a single witness to tell you this is how it happened. If she's supposed to have shot him, you might be wondering, can she shoot a gun? If she can shoot a gun, is she a good shot? We know that this is a head shot, okay, a head wound. You may be wondering, is there space in the room for her to have shot him in the way I suppose she would have had to without causing stippling? You guys remember you learned about stippling. If you're close to someone, you're going to see all those red pot marks. You might be wondering, does the trajectory work? Does the trajectory of the bullet through his head and into the wall, where they dug it out of the wall, does that work with her? Is there a place in the room for her to stand where that trajectory makes sense? Or does the room itself, do the dimensions of the room make that impossible? And I'll tell you right now, you're just going to have to excuse my handwriting, because it's not great. We can see that. You might be wondering, what about her height and his height on the bed? If he's sitting on the bed and she's standing over there, and again, this is me hypothetically saying she's standing over here because they didn't have a witness tell us. No witness has gotten up here and said she'd stand over here, shoot him in the head, any of that. What about their heights? Does that work? Does that work with the bullet angle? Or does that show that she can't have shot him from over there? You've heard about contact gunshot wounds. You've heard some evidence that this might have been a contact gunshot wound. How on earth is she supposed to have walked up to him and put a gun to the side of his head and pulled the trigger, and there's no sign of struggle whatsoever?
The speaker says that the prosecution never explained how the murder happened. No witness showed how the shooter acted, where she stood, or how she fired the gun. They raise questions about the bullet's path, the contact gunshot wound, and the heights of the people, showing that the details of the murder were never proven.
How does that work? Does it work with her standing up? Or would she have to sit down next to him on the bed and hold her arm across like this? How does that work? How does any of that work? Some of you thought of questions that I haven't even talked about, that I haven't even addressed. All of these questions are reasonable doubts. All of these questions are reason there cannot be a conviction in this case. And whatever question you have in your mind, whatever thing you thought of, I can tell you with 100% certainty, the state did not address it, they did not overcome it, they did not rule it out. Why can I say that? Why can I say that with certainty? Because they never put up a single witness to tell you how this would have happened. Now they're going to come after me, and they're going to say they're proving this case with circumstantial evidence. Okay? That's what all the Susan said this and Susan said that and Susan didn't pay the utility bill and whatever, all that. That's supposed to be circumstantial evidence. But if the state is proving this case with circumstantial evidence, that evidence has to be so strong that it rules out any reasonable hypothesis except for one, the hypothesis of guilt. You don't even have to believe other hypotheses. They just have to exist and be reasonable. So if you're talking in deliberation and you say, someone says, well, I think, what about this? This is a reasonable hypothesis. And you say, yeah, I don't believe that, but it's reasonable. That's it. That is a not guilty. There is no conviction. Now, what do we know about the circumstantial evidence that actually relates to murder, not just Susan had house rules, Susan's a bad person? It shows that she was there. And that's about it for the circumstantial evidence as to murder. And as the judge is going to instruct you, being there is not enough. We call that mere presence. There's actually a specific instruction for it. Mere presence, where someone, if you are at a scene where something happens, that does not mean, that is not enough to say you are guilty of anything. Okay? So showing she's there is not enough. I mean, what were they doing? What were they doing with this case? We've been here for 2 weeks. We've heard from 3 experts from the state side. We've heard from family members. We've heard from coworkers. We've heard from doctors. We've heard from all these witnesses. And no one has given you what you need to prove murder. I mean, they just got so wrapped up in trying to rule out suicide and trying to do this, step 1, that they never moved on to step 2. They never gave the evidence needed to prove murder.
The speaker explains that the prosecution never proved how the murder happened. All questions about how it could have occurred remain unanswered, creating reasonable doubt. The so-called circumstantial evidence only shows the person was present, which is not enough for a conviction. Despite 2 weeks of testimony from experts, family, and others, no evidence was provided to prove murder.
What would it have looked like if they had done it? What would a real murder trial look like, where they are actually giving you evidence to prove a murder, to prove how this murder took place, to deal with all your reasonable doubts? Well, like anything, it would come from the witness stand. You would have a witness talk about it. And that witness can talk about all of these things we wrote down here. They can address, yes, she was standing here, and we think she, based on where we recovered the shell casing, that she shot like this, and the trajectory works, and their heights match up, and there's no problem with the wall, and there's no problem with the space in the room. It checks out. But they didn't do that. They got experts who spent all their time talking about bed sheets and blood spatter, and nobody who told you how the murder happened. I have never been a part of or seen a case where the state does not address the murder part of a murder charge. It's unheard of. It's unheard of because you can't have your reasonable doubts about the murder satisfied if they don't tell you anything about the murder, if they don't offer you any evidence about the murder. How can you convict a woman of murder if you don't know how she's even supposed to have done it? And that brings up another problem. The absence itself is doubt. The absence itself is doubt. Do you think that if they had all these things, or any of these things, excuse me, do you think if they had any of these things that showed murder, that explained what's going on here, they would have just kept that to themselves? They would have kept it a secret, not told you about it, not bothered putting up a witness? No. What does that tell you about this? What does that tell you about the theory? It's not provable with evidence. They can't do it. They didn't put anybody up because they can't get anyone to say, yes, this is a murder. This is how it happened. Now, when I got up here the first time, I wrote down rule out suicide because I knew the evidence couldn't do that. But never in my wildest dreams did I think they would stop there at trying and failing to rule out suicide and not even go on to prove the murder. I mean, let's be clear. We heard a closing argument yesterday from the state. A closing argument. And they didn't tell you how she's supposed to have done this, what she's supposed to have done. Imagine that. They still haven't told you. How does the conversation go if you're trying to explain this murder to someone else? You know, yeah, we convicted her of a murder. Okay, well, you know, what was the evidence? Well, he died of a gunshot wound and she was there. Okay, well, she shot him. Did she shoot him from close up or far away? I don't know. Really didn't get into that. Okay, well, did the trajectory work? We didn't talk about the trajectory.
The speaker explains that the prosecution never showed how the murder actually happened. A proper murder trial would include witnesses explaining details like where she was standing, how the bullet traveled, and how everything in the room fit the scenario. But here, no witness addressed these facts, so the jury never saw evidence proving the murder. The lack of explanation itself creates reasonable doubt, making it impossible to convict because the state never provided the necessary proof.
Okay, was there space in the room for her to do this? I don't know. Now, just to be clear, they did not rule out suicide. They did not rule out suicide. You heard Will Imbert testify that his dad liked to shoot his right-handed gun with his left hand. Okay, you can take that or leave it. The only way it rules out suicide is if you heard that he can't shoot with his right hand, that he can't do it. And they keep saying things like, this was the most important shot Jake Ember was going to take, which I think is a very strange way to talk about suicide. But I think we can all agree it's not a hard shot to make. It's not a hard shot. You can shoot yourself in the head with either hand. And basically, their whole the suicide looks weird thing collapsed when we talked about the EMTs, because it was based on the idea that nobody could have touched the body with Susan and before Susan, and nobody touched the body before the pictures were taken. And if someone had, that meant Susan murdered him, was trying to stage a crime scene or something like that. But why not call the EMTs? Did you hear from any EMTs? If that's so important, if the movement on the bed is so important, do we want to hear from the EMTs who may have checked for a pulse, who may have tried to see whether he was dead, who may have moved the body just like they're saying, just like Brian Smith was talking about? Every single one of those EMTs that they didn't call is walking reasonable doubt. They could have called him. They didn't. So, speaking of the EMTs, let's talk about James Adams, the first officer on the scene. We learned through James Adams that EMTs were there when he got there. We learned through James Adams that, and I'm just going to move this a little bit, that an EMT gave him the shell casing, in fact, and we know that when he was taking this picture at 11:21, what were the EMTs doing? The EMTs were requesting the coroner. They'd done everything they could do. They determined he was deceased, and they needed to have the coroner come out. So by the time James Adams is taking this photograph, the EMTs have already done everything they're going to do at the scene. Okay? But let's ask the big question. Did James Adams, did any of these witnesses, I'm going to try to ask it with every single witness.
The prosecution never ruled out suicide. Witness testimony shows Jake could have shot himself easily, and claims that suicide looks weird aren't enough to prove murder. The EMTs at the scene were not called to clarify if the body was moved, which leaves more doubts. Even the first officer, James Adams, confirmed EMTs had already done their work and there was no evidence showing murder. All these missing testimonies create reasonable doubt about whether a murder even occurred.
Did any of these witnesses tell us anything about how the murder's supposed to happen? No. Did they tell us anything that would rule out suicide as a possibility? No. Did he tell us that he believed it was a suicide? Yes. Like every single other professional who arrived on that scene, who looked at that scene with their own eyeballs, he thought this was a suicide. He told us nothing about murder. And we had Officer Rogers. Remember Officer Rogers? Did Officer Rogers tell us anything that could rule out suicide? No. Did he tell us anything that could explain the murder or give you an idea of how it was committed? No. We heard from Coroner Fowler. Now, when you have a witness who you think is going to give you testimony that's going to be contradicted by the evidence, it's a good idea to just lock that witness into that testimony and then bring the evidence, confront them with the evidence. So that's what we did with Mr. Fowler. We locked him into the statement that he changed the death certificate on or by August 26, 2014, and then confronted him with the fact that Lee Wilson was still talking to him and calling him and writing him letters and all this stuff, trying to get this changed from a suicide to a murder after he said he's already done it. And you remember what his explanation was. The best he could come up with was that maybe Lee Wilson just didn't know that he'd already changed the death certificate back in August. And that's why they were still talking about, we got to get this changed. We got to get this changed from a suicide to a murder. You get to judge the credibility of the witnesses. So I'll leave the credibility of Coroner Fowler on this issue up to you. But whatever you think about his credibility, did he tell us anything that would make this a murder? No, he did not. Did he tell us anything to rule out suicide? No. In fact, he told us that he ruled this a suicide, a contact gunshot wound to the head that was self-inflicted. There's nothing making him do that, okay? And I want to talk a little bit about that because the state's theory seems to be now that Susan lied to Coroner Fowler and tricked him into saying it was a contact gunshot wound and it was a suicide, and then once he found out that she was lying, he changed it. That's mostly from the closing argument of the state, because it's not supported at all by the witnesses. What did we actually hear? What did Coroner Fowler actually testify to? He said he overheard a conversation between Miss Ember and a law enforcement officer where Will Embert is standing right next to Susan, okay? He's taking his notes, and he's overhearing this conversation, and she used the word we. And he mistakenly thought that the word we meant her and Will were in the house, okay? It's not some Susan tricked the coroner. No, the coroner made a mistake, if he's telling the truth about that conversation, made a mistake about Susan Ember and the word we, who that encompasses. And even then, even if you believe this, that he accidentally wrote suicide because he overheard this conversation, which is hard to fathom, that that's what determines the cause of death. Even if you believe that, that doesn't trick him into writing contact gunshot wound, okay? These people are trained. You're trained. You write contact gunshot wound only if there's evidence of a contact gunshot wound.
None of the witnesses, including Officer Rogers and Coroner Fowler, provided any information showing how a murder could have happened or proving it wasn't suicide. Coroner Fowler confirmed the death was a self-inflicted contact gunshot wound, and any claims that Susan tricked him are false. He simply misunderstood a conversation. Even if there was a miscommunication, it doesn't change the medical evidence. A contact gunshot wound is determined by what the coroner observed, not by anyone's words. Everything points to suicide, and there's no evidence proving murder.
And we learned that's a very specific thing, right? So he can write gunshot wound to the head, anything like that. Contact gunshot wound came from his own observations at the scene, from him looking at the wound, feeling the wound, doing the things that he did, that he's trained to do. That's why the word contact is on there, okay? That doesn't get explained away no matter what Susan Ember says. Even if Susan had had a conversation with him where she lied to him, that doesn't change contact gunshot wound. So now you've got to believe, I guess, that she's standing or sitting right next to him with a gun pressed up against his head. And just to go back to Will for a little bit, We heard that he thought he saw blood on Susan Ember's hand. The problem with that is he didn't tell anybody at the scene. He didn't tell anybody. The scene is swarming with police officers. He's right there next to Susan while she's giving a statement. Doesn't tell a single person at the scene. Not a soul. The police officers who were there, you think if they're responding to a gunshot, a homicide, suicide, whatever, I mean, they go in treating everything like it's the worst possible thing. You think they might look at people's hands? You think they might check to see if there's blood on them? Nobody at the scene, no police say there's blood on Susan Ember's hand. I think they look for that. It's also, we don't know what he saw on her hand. We also know that if she tried to get the dog off the bed or any of that stuff, that's a way to get blood on your hand. So none of this stuff works to rule out suicide or prove a murder. We heard from Steve Shimon, the firearm tool expert who got the gun, said in a lot of suicides he gets, the gun's got more blood or debris on it. But he also said he thought he saw biological material in the barrel of the gun. You learned that he tested the gun for blood, and it was positive. He talked about aerosolized blood, exactly the kind of blood you would get with a contact gunshot wound. Okay? Now, if there's aerosolized blood on that gun, we learned from, I think, just about all the experts, it's very hard to see. But also, how on earth do you get the aerosolized blood on the gun and in the gun, inside the gun, on those bullets that you heard about? How does the blood get on them if it's not a contact gunshot wound? Okay? If their theory is Susan shot him from over here, and he's here.
The coroner's finding of a contact gunshot wound is based on his trained observations at the scene and cannot be changed by any conversation or claim. Claims that Susan had blood on her hands are unreliable because no one at the scene, including the police, noticed it, and there are natural ways she could have had blood on her hands without committing a crime. Forensic evidence, like biological material and aerosolized blood in the gun, supports a contact gunshot wound, which is consistent with suicide, and does not support the theory that she shot him from a distance.
How does the blood get sucked into that gun? How does it travel way faster than it could possibly travel to get inside the gun? It can't. So the only explanation you're left with is that the theory now has to be standing or sitting, if the angles work. I don't know, you don't know, because they never put up a single witness to tell us, contacting his head. And he doesn't move, and he doesn't struggle, and he doesn't turn away. You heard from Brian Smith, Agent Brian Smith. I really admire Agent Brian Smith, even though he doesn't like me using the term right-handed gun, because you saw how hard they tried to push Agent Smith to go further than the facts would let him, to go further than he was comfortable with his testimony. You remember he just kept saying, stuck to his guns. If absent some other blood-bearing surface in the room, there's a little void. I think that the body may have been moved a little bit. Can't say why, can't say who did it, can't say what it means, can't say if it's indicative of suicide, can't say if it's murder, can't say anything. I mean, his refrain was, can't rule it out, can't rule it out, can't rule it out. Can't rule it out is a not guilty verdict. If there are things that you can't rule out, that is not guilty. The state has to rule them out for you using evidence from this witness stand. And that time has passed. Whatever they come up with after me to explain this all away, understand that I am talking about the absence of evidence. There is nothing they can do to cure that at this point. We heard from Dr. Houston, and you remember how shocked the state was when they actually heard the testimony of their own witness. You heard from Dr. Houston, you heard Devin ask Dr. Houston, what would you have done if Jake Ember came to you and expressed a suicidal ideation? What would have happened if Jake came in and said, I think I'm in trouble. I think I'm suicidal. He would have been put on an antidepressant and referred to a psychiatrist. What did we learn happened? He was put on an antidepressant and he was referred to a psychiatrist. We also learned that he was taken off the antipsychotic that he was taking right after his second heart attack and right before he committed suicide. That is as clear a line as you can get in terms of medical causation. Has a second heart attack, taken off his antipsychotic, commits suicide. You also heard from Rachel Ember. You heard and you saw how badly she needs this to be a murder and not a suicide. How badly she needs to believe her father could not take his own life. That is completely understandable. Completely. You heard her tell you when she got to the scene, she had her fists balled up.
The blood inside the gun only fits a contact shot. No witness explained how someone else could have shot Jake without struggle, and experts couldn't rule out anything. Medical evidence pointed to suicide, and emotional claims from family didn't change that. There was no proof it was murder.
She ran up to Susan and she said, what the fuck happened? What the fuck happened? There is nothing, no evidence, nothing anyone could say that is going to make her believe her father was capable of taking his own life. Nothing at all. You heard from Yvonne Magnus. You heard that Yvonne hired Lee Wilson. And you remember Lee Wilson. Rachel and Yvonne have spent the last 12 years with Lee Wilson trying to get this turned from a suicide into a murder. The problem is, when you're taking 12 years to do that, sometimes your statements change. You saw how often Ms. Hyman had to come up here and confront the witness with a previous sworn statement. We heard from Douglas Buckner. We learned through him that Jake had a hard time trading the car. Trading the car was hard on Jake, of course it was. And also, just to do with Douglas Buckner, this whole idea that just popped up in the state's closing argument about Douglas Buckner was going to tell Jake something on Saturday, so Susan had to kill Jake. That moved up her timeline. We know from the testimony, you know from the testimony, that's false. You know from the testimony that him and Jake were talking and texting and had a regular flow of communication. We know, in fact, that he even revealed the big secret that Susan had texted him, the thing that was supposed to make, Jake was going to divorce her or something like that. He told him about that on Friday. She didn't have to kill him to keep him from going to the racetrack. There's nothing to support that. And also, the idea that they're getting divorced is this new thing that's invented by the state, that there's no evidence to show at all. The one thing you have is a question from Will, a teenager, who, for him, I don't know if your ideas about marriage and love have changed since you've been a teenager, but for him, any fight is a reason to break up. So he asks his dad, are you and Susan going to break up? No. There's no evidence that they were getting a divorce. There's no evidence that he wanted to divorce her. There's none of that. It's just pure speculation, and it's meant to distract you from this, from all of the real questions, the evidence questions that you have about this murder. Let's go back to Jake and this car, because the state keeps talking about it like he never would have killed himself given what was going on with the car. And I don't know if they just haven't thought about this or they don't want to talk about it, but isn't it possible that trading away this race car that he's worked on for 17 years, trading that away, watching someone else own it, watching someone else drive it, watching someone else get it running, that maybe that wasn't a happy thing for Jake Ember? That maybe that was, in fact, one of the things that led him to end his life on that day? He did not want to go to the racetrack and see that car that he no longer owned being driven by somebody else down that track. I mean, when we're talking about suicidal people, I hope we all agree that when you're suicidal, you're not making rational decisions. I hope we agree on that. Mr. Edwards talked about kamikaze pilots in World War II yesterday. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who is deeply depressed, someone who has anxiety, someone who has panic attacks that look so bad they look like seizures, someone who's had 2 heart attacks, someone who's losing their autonomy, someone whose world is closing in. That is the state that Jake Ember was in when he took his own life.
Jake's daughter immediately blamed Susan and could never accept suicide, so she and another family member spent years trying to change the case to murder, even as stories and claims shifted over time. Allegations about divorce, secret plans, or Susan needing to stop Jake were not supported by evidence, and testimony showed those ideas were speculation. At the same time, witnesses described Jake as emotionally and medically struggling, dealing with depression, anxiety, serious health issues, and the loss of his race car, all of which made suicide a realistic possibility rather than murder.
And the state is also saying, oh, well, he wouldn't take his own life if he had plans that day, if he'd made plans to do something. People who are suicidal are not behaving rationally. If you are deciding to take your own life, you are canceling all your plans. You are deciding not to live anymore. The fact that you have something that is happening that afternoon is not going to stop you from taking your own life once you've decided to do it. Now, we heard from Bruce Willis, the guy who teaches the experts, and we heard all of the reasons that this scene does not support anything that the state is trying to get it to support, that you can't make any of the conclusions they're trying to get you to draw. You can basically say, there's a body, it could have been moved, might not have been moved, suicide, homicide, I don't know, right? Now, Bruce is a guy who testifies for the state. He testifies for this DA's office. When the evidence is there, he's the first guy on the stand to put the bad people in prison. You remember how shocked the state was when they learned how much he'd been paid? $800. They had to ask the question twice. Only $800? You did all this work for only $800? I mean, is that how it works? Is that how it works? Is there nothing that is more important than money? Is it possible that there's something more important to people like Bruce Willis or even Brian Smith, that they won't go beyond what the evidence shows? Is it possible that one of those things is making sure that the people who don't have anything, the Susan Embers, don't get run over every single time by the people who can afford to hire a private investigator for 12 years? That could be more important than money. It could be more important than money to keep an innocent woman out of prison. That could be more important than money. I mean, how does it work? Who gets justice? Who gets justice? Is it just the people who can afford to put a private investigator at counsel table? Have him sit at counsel table throughout the entire trial? Have him work for 12 years? Or is it the people who can't do that? Do they get justice too? Luckily, they don't get to answer that question. You do. You get to answer that question. We heard from Lee Wilson. Lee Wilson did his best to try to give Coroner Fowler an out on the whole statement that he changed the death certificate on August 26, 2014. And by an out, I mean a reason for that. When he's giving the testimony and everyone outside of this jury box knows that what he's telling me isn't true. Now, Lee Wilson didn't jump up and stop the testimony and tell his lawyer, the lawyers to correct it or anything like that, because he said, it's just a mistake. It's just a mistake. Just a clerical error. Okay. That's one theory.
The state argued Jake wouldn't have committed suicide because he had plans that day, but experts clarified that suicidal people often act irrationally, and having plans doesn't rule out suicide. Testimony from experts like Bruce Willis and Lee Wilson showed the evidence didn't support the state's claims of murder. It also highlighted the role of money and resources, noting that private investigators can influence a case, but ultimately, it's up to the jury to weigh the evidence and ensure justice is fairly applied.
Another theory is that Coroner Fowler knew exactly how suspicious that would look. He knew exactly how suspicious, how bad it would look if he only changed the death certificate right after months of meeting with Lee Wilson to get this changed from a suicide to a murder. He understood exactly how bad that would look. And this is why, again, our criminal investigators, our police, yours and mine, they don't work for private individuals. They work for the state. Because when you start an investigation with a set goal in mind, you're going to try to get somebody convicted of something, you're not following the evidence. You're just trying to find things to support your theory. You're finding things to support your goal, especially if you have a financial incentive to do so. That's the problem. But what happens when you do that, when you have a case like that, is you end up with this. You end up with a whole bunch of stuff that makes one person look bad, but doesn't do anything to tell you about this, to prove murder. That's the kind of case you end up with. That's why we don't investigate crimes like that. Now, let's talk a little bit about something the state likes to talk about a lot, which is the 911 phone call. And on the 911 phone call, Susan Ember says, Jake Ember is gay. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And I don't know how much experience you have with trauma or anything like that, but I think we can agree that people in those situations don't always make a lot of sense, especially if they are dealing with something like finding their spouse who has just taken their own life. All the anxieties, all the things that you heard about in her testimony, the problems with their sex life, low T that you learned about from Dr. Houston, all those anxieties come out in whatever she's saying. She's finding a reason that this happened. I think you can even hear her on the call say something to the effect of, how could you do this? How could you do this to me? She's trying to find a reason. Now, I want you to listen to her voice on that call. I want you to listen to the sound she is making. I want you to listen to the grief and the sadness and the inability to process what is going on. And I want you to ask yourself, really ask, if you think that my client is that good of an actor, if you think that the person who is mixing up PTSD and STDs is that good of an actor, is that kind of a Hannibal Lecter, ice-cold killer who is capable of executing her husband at point-blank range and then meticulously, but impossibly quickly, arranging a crime scene that is so well staged it fools everyone, and then making that phone call. Does that seem reasonable? And even if you think she's capable of that, even if you think she's capable, they still have to prove that she actually did it. Which witness did that? Which witness told you about that? Not a single one.
Coroner Fowler's actions and the 911 call were misinterpreted by the state to suggest guilt. The argument highlights that investigators or private individuals with a goal, like proving murder, can twist evidence to fit their theory instead of following the facts. Susan Ember's 911 call, where she expresses shock, grief, and confusion, shows her emotional state after finding her husband dead and doesn't prove she committed murder. The point is that even if someone thinks she could have done it, the state never presented a witness or evidence showing she actually did, so there's no proof of guilt.
They haven't told you how this is physically possible. And even though they haven't given you a theory of the case, and we could literally just sit there and not say anything, and this would be not guilty, because they haven't given you a theory. But I think we need to deal with some of the problems that are obvious from the evidence that's been admitted. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Jennifer Hyman, to come up here for a moment. I'm just going to put, and again, this is a picture that contains material that may prove disturbing if people want to adjust accordingly. So, we know, or I think we know, I don't know because the state hasn't really talked about it at all, that he would have had to have been facing forward because he's shot on this side of the head, right? So, Jen, we're just going to do the measuring tape. And when we get to 12 feet, we've heard from their expert that we at 12 feet, their expert, that you can get stippling at 12 feet. At 12 feet, she's outside that room. She's outside the room at 12 feet. Where's the 12 feet for her to stand? Here. Here. Where is it? She perched on the dresser? Where is it? Okay, so maybe it's not 12 feet, and it's closer, and it's closer. But then you're getting stippling. And we would have seen all those red stippling marks, like the one Bruce Willis showed you. Okay? So now, their theory has to be, it's a contact wound. She's standing right there, or sitting. I don't know if the angle works, if she's standing, but it's a contact wound. And once she shoots, all she has to do is put the gun down to stage the scene. That's all she has to do. And we've seen his hand in that picture. They made a big deal about there's no blood on his hand. Now, we of course heard that there's aerosolized blood on the hand, and a lot of times you don't see blood and all that. There's no blood on the hand. That means it had to be staged. Okay, well then why is the fact that she's got blood on her hand, how is that evidence of staging? If all she had to do was just plop the gun right there. It doesn't make any sense. All of these things, all of these questions were questions that had to be dealt with by witnesses from that stand. Now, I know the government has not proved its case, but what they're really going to do next is what starts to concern you, because they're going to ask you to make up for that fact. They're going to ask you to fill in the holes. In spite of giving you no evidence, they're going to ask you to convict this woman, Susan Ember, of murder. They're going to say it's your responsibility or it's your duty or whatever. This is the moment that the jury box was invented for. This is the moment the founders saw 250 years ago. The founders weren't perfect, but boy, were they familiar with a government who throws people in jail without evidence. That's why they put this protection in place. That's why they made sure that the only people who could do that were a jury of someone's peers. A jury of someone's peers was the only group they could trust to make the government rule out every reasonable doubt, to require the government to prove every element of every part of its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Not a group of prosecutors, not a group of judges, not a group of nobles. A group of people from that person's community could be trusted to protect that person.
The state never explained how the shooting could have physically happened. The distances, angles, and blood evidence don't line up with their suggestions, and every possible theory creates new problems they never proved with witnesses. The defense says the state failed to present a clear, supported theory and is instead asking the jury to guess and fill in the gaps. The point is that the burden is not on the jury to fix missing evidence, but on the state to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, which they did not do.
I want you to ask how she's supposed to have committed this murder. And if you can't answer that definitively, if you can't say that, if you can't explain it to each other, find Susan Ember not guilty. When you go back to deliberate, ask, did they rule out suicide? And if someone says yes, ask them, what's the thing that made suicide impossible as a reasonable possibility? Not whether you believe it or not. What's the thing that made it impossible to be a reasonable possibility? There's many things we know about Jake that contributed, that made it reasonable. It's never reasonable. That made it understandable for him to commit suicide. All of the medications he was taking, being taken off the antipsychotic, having medications increased, the health problems, the heart attacks, the financial problems, the loss of autonomy, the loss of his prized possession. All of these things make it reasonable. Ask, did they prove murder? Explain the murder to each other. Because they want you to just plug or ignore these holes in their case. But you have sworn an oath not to do that. You have sworn an oath on your honor not to do that, to take only evidence, to judge only on evidence from here, to see whether the state has proved every element. And I was talking to a good friend about wrongful convictions, and he said something that stuck with me, and I want to read it so I know I'm getting it right. He said, you know, at some point, every jury in those cases talked themselves into accepting what the state was telling them instead of questioning it. At some point, every jury in those cases talked themselves into accepting what the state was telling them instead of questioning it.
The jury is focused on the facts and asked themselves the key questions. How could Susan have committed this murder? Did the evidence rule out suicide? The defense points out that nothing definitively proves murder, while many factors make suicide reasonable, like Jake's health, medications, financial problems, and personal losses. The jury is reminded not to fill gaps or guess for the state, because their oath is to judge only based on evidence, not speculation. The warning is that juries in other cases have been misled by assumptions instead of questioning the evidence carefully.
And it's stuck with me. It's stuck with me because you've seen these wrongful conviction cases. And you've seen the state doesn't take responsibility. What do they say? They always say, oh, we gave it to the jury. We put it in the jury's hands and let the jury decide. Clean hands. Clean hands. I wonder how those juries feel about that. The state will sleep fine no matter what happens in this case. In a minute, they're going to act like it will be the end of the world if you do not convict this person. But as soon as this is over, it ends for them. They go right on to the next thing. Don't let them sacrifice your oath, your honor for this. It's too important. It's too important. Do what you're sworn to do. Look at the evidence, at the lack of evidence, and tell them no. Say, you had 12 years to prepare a case. You had 12 years to bring this. And you did not bring us evidence to prove murder. You did not bring us the evidence that the law requires you to bring us. If you wanted a conviction, you needed to bring us the witnesses. You needed to bring us the proof. Not the innuendo, not the rhetorical flourishes. You needed to bring us the evidence. Do not let them make you their accomplices in this 12-year destruction of Susan Ember's life. Do not let them do that. Tell them no. You are the most powerful people. When you are in that box, you are the most powerful people in our legal system. You are the guardians of the law. Use that power. Use that power in the deliberation room. Tell the state no. We will not sacrifice our oath. We will not go back on our oath. We will not sacrifice our word, our honor. Give this woman her life back. After 12 years, give this woman her life back. Find Susan not guilty. Thank you for your service.
The jury stayed true to their oath and focused only on the evidence. The defense emphasizes that the state had 12 years to prove murder but failed to provide witnesses or solid proof. Instead of being swayed by pressure or assumptions, the jury should recognize their power in the justice system, protect the law, and deliver a verdict based solely on evidence. The clear message: Susan Ember should be found not guilty because the state did not meet its burden of proof. If you want to see more in-depth case analyses like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment below. Share your thoughts on the verdict and tell us what you think really happened. Your perspective matters, and the next case is just around the corner.